We split the atom. We landed on the moon. We invented the internet. And yet, the human species is still capable of losing a battle of wits against a bottle of soy sauce. Today, we are honoring the pioneers of poor judgment, 10 individuals who looked at the laws of physics and said, "I bet I can take you." Evolution usually takes millions of years. These guys did it in seconds. Do not attempt. 1. Let's talk about the modern human condition, specifically the lethal combination of unearned confidence, a 2-ton metal projectile, and the burning desire to correct strangers on the internet. Our first contender for the ultimate participation trophy in the game of life is a gentleman we'll call Gary. Now, Gary wasn't just a driver. He was a self-appointed sheriff of the asphalt, a man who viewed the highway code not as a set of laws but as a personal manifesto that only he truly understood. Gary's psychological profile was a fascinating mix of short fuse and high data plan. He was the kind of guy who would scream at a microwave for taking too long to pop popcorn and viewed a yellow light as a personal challenge to his masculinity. On a fateful Tuesday afternoon, Gary was cruising down the interstate, likely listening to a podcast about how to optimize his alpha brainwaves, when he witnessed a crime against humanity. A minivan in front of him merged without using a turn signal. For a normal person, this is a minor annoyance, a fleeting moment of, "Ugh, people." For Gary, this was a declaration of war. It was a moral failing that required immediate digital adjudication. He couldn't just yell at his windshield, that's for amateurs. He needed an audience. He needed the court of public opinion. So, while traveling at 70 miles per hour, a speed at which your car covers the length of a football field in the time it takes to sneeze, Gary whipped out his smartphone. This device, smarter than its owner by several orders of magnitude, was about to become the black box of his stupidity. He unlocked Facebook, the premier destination for shouting into the void, and began to compose his masterpiece. Now, the physics of this situation are terrified screaming. His eyes are on the screen, his knees are vaguely steering, and his brain is focused on spelling incompetent correctly rather than the curvature of the earth approaching his bumper. He wasn't just typing a status, he was crafting a dissertation. He titled it mentally, "The Epidemic of Laziness." He typed furiously, "It absolutely disgusts me how people think they own the road. If you can't pay attention to your surroundings, you shouldn't be behind the wheel." The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. He was writing a condemnation of distracted driving while engaging in the most aggressive form of distracted driving possible. It's a level of meta-hypocrisy that would make a literary critic weep with joy. He was so engrossed in his own righteous indignation, so focused on hitting the perfect emoji to convey his disdain for bad drivers, that he failed to notice the road decided to bank sharply to the left. The laws of physics, unlike traffic laws, are strictly enforced and carry a mandatory death penalty for violations. As Gary prepared to hit post, imagining the likes and validation rolling in from his echo chamber, his sedan drifted onto the rumble strips. Instead of correcting, his thumb hovered over the blue button. He looked up a fraction of a second too late. His car left the pavement, turned into an unguided missile, and introduced itself intimately to a large, unyielding oak tree that had been standing there since the Civil War. The impact was instantaneous. The phone, miraculously, survived the crash, landing on the floor mat with the draft still open, a glowing tombstone for his stupidity. The police report later noted the unfinished post, and you have to imagine the officer who found it had to take a long, deep breath to keep from laughing out of sheer disbelief. Gary died as he lived, angry, distracted, and completely oblivious to the fact that he was the problem. He wanted to go viral. Instead, he just went terminal, becoming the very thing he hated most: a traffic obstruction caused by an idiot. 2. Nature is majestic, awe-inspiring, and frankly, completely indifferent to whether you live or die, a fact that our next candidate discovered in the most slippery way possible. The setting was a breathtaking waterfall park, a place where millions of gallons of water thunder over a precipice every minute, creating a roar that screams "Stay back" in a universal language. But for Brenda, a tourist whose sense of self-preservation had been eroded by a lifetime of safety rails and warning labels she never read, the waterfall wasn't a deadly force of nature. It was just a background aesthetic for her day. Brenda was the type of person who haggled at garage sales and kept ketchup packets from 2008 in her fridge, just in case. She understood the price of everything and the value of nothing, especially her own existence. The tragedy began with a gust of wind, a gentle nudge from Mother Nature testing the gene pool. Brenda was wearing a baseball cap, a cheap, fraying piece of merchandise she'd likely picked up at a gas station for $5. As she leaned over the railing to get a better look at the churning abyss, the wind lifted the hat from her head and deposited it onto a mossy rock ledge just a few feet beyond the safety barrier. Now, a rational human being looks at a hat on a wet rock near a waterfall and says, "Well, the river owns that hat now." They mourn the $5 and move on. Brenda, however, performed a quick mental calculation and decided that $5 was worth risking immediate death for. She looked at the barrier. It was a sturdy metal fence, plastered with signs featuring skulls, crossbones, and text in 3 languages that essentially translated to, "If you cross this, you're an idiot, and you will die." Brenda treated these signs like the terms and conditions of a software update. She scrolled right past them with her eyes and prepared to climb. Witnesses later reported shouting at her, begging her to leave the hat, but Brenda was on a mission. She swung her legs over the railing, her eyes locked on the prize. She lowered herself onto the rocks, which were coated in a layer of algae that had the friction coefficient of a greased bobsled track. She took one step, confident in her non-slip sneakers, and reached for the hat. And that's when physics took the wheel. Her foot found zero purchase on the slime-covered stone. In a cartoonish moment of realization, her legs went horizontal, and gravity did the rest. She didn't even get to grab the hat. She slid past it, scraping her fingernails uselessly against the wet stone, and plunged into the rapids. The current, moving at a speed that makes Olympic swimmers look like they're treading treacle, grabbed her instantly. She was swept over the edge of the falls before the screams of the onlookers had even faded. The irony? When the park rangers recovered her body downstream, the hat was still sitting on the rock, perfectly safe, mocking her final decision. She had traded decades of potential life, experiences, and love for a piece of fabric made in a sweatshop that cost less than a sandwich. It's a harsh lesson in economics. The sunk cost fallacy is real, and sometimes the price of retrieval is everything you have. 3. The humble soybean. When fermented, it gives us soy sauce, a salty, savory delight that elevates sushi and stir-fries. It is a condiment, a flavor enhancer, a background player in the culinary orchestra. It is not, however, a Gatorade substitute. This is a distinction that most toddlers understand instinctively, but it was a concept entirely lost on Derek, a 20-something male whose brain was seemingly powered by testosterone and bad decisions. Derek was the kind of guy who viewed his body not as a temple, but as a biological amusement park where the rides were dangerous and the maintenance was non-existent. He was at a party, the breeding ground for 90% of all Darwin awards, when the conversation turned to feats of strength and endurance. Someone, likely joking, bet Derek that he couldn't chug a full quart bottle of soy sauce in under 2 minutes. Most people would laugh and grab a beer. Derek, however, heard the challenge and interpreted it as a questioning of his manhood. He grabbed the bottle with the intensity of a warrior grabbing his sword. Now, let's pause for a quick science lesson on why this is a catastrophically bad idea. Your body relies on a delicate balance of water and salt to function, a state known as homeostasis. When you introduce a massive amount of salt into your system rapidly, you trigger a condition called hypernatremia. Essentially, your blood becomes so salty that it starts sucking water out of your cells through osmosis to balance things out. The most critical cells that get dehydrated in this process? The ones in your brain. When brain cells dehydrate, they shrink, tearing blood vessels and causing hemorrhages. Derek was about to pickle his own brain while his friends cheered him on. He unscrewed the cap, the smell of concentrated sodium filling the room, and began to chug. It was thick, black, and aggressively salty, like drinking the ocean if the ocean had been reduced to a syrup. His gag reflex screamed, "Stop!" But Derek's ego screamed, "Louder!" He powered through, finishing the bottle in record time, slamming it onto the table to thunderous applause. He felt like a champion. For about 3 minutes, Then, the biology kicked in. He started complaining that he felt weird, which is the understatement of the century considering his neurons were currently shriveling like raisins in the sun. He stumbled, his speech slurring not from alcohol, but from his brainstem literally malfunctioning as the fluid shifted in his skull. His friends thought he was acting part of the joke until he collapsed into a seizure. By the time the paramedics arrived, Derek was in a deep coma. The doctors tried to flush the salt out, but the damage was catastrophic. The fluid shift in his cranium was too severe to reverse. He never woke up. He died because he couldn't back down from a bet involving a sushi condiment. In the end, Derek proved he had an iron stomach, sure, but he also proved he had a brain that was, quite literally, not worth its salt. He left behind a grieving family and a legacy that serves as a grim reminder. Just because you can drink something doesn't mean it won't turn your gray matter into beef jerky. 4. There are few forces on Earth more powerful than a severe thunderstorm, but one of them is apparently the cliffhanger of a daytime soap opera. This story takes us to the suburbs, where the weather was apocalyptic, but the drama on TV was just getting spicy. Meet Linda, a woman whose dedication to her favorite show, Passion's Stormy Cove, bordered on religious zealotry. Linda was the kind of person who scheduled her entire life around the 2 p.m. broadcast, viewing any interruption not as a technical glitch, but as a personal attack by the universe. On this particular afternoon, the sky turned that bruised shade of purple that usually signals, "Go to the basement," and the thunder was rattling the fillings in her teeth. Just as the main character, Ricardo, was about to reveal who truly fathered the twins, the screen went black. Static. The signal was lost. Now, a normal human being with a functioning survival instinct would say, "Well, that sucks," and wait for the storm to pass. Linda, however, operated on a level of obsession that bypassed logic entirely. She decided that the problem was the antenna on the roof, and the solution was manual intervention. Right now, in the middle of a torrential downpour that was flooding the streets, she grabbed her ladder, which was already a bad idea, but then she made the decision that catapulted her into the Darwin Award Hall of Fame. Because it was raining, she didn't want to get wet. So, she grabbed an umbrella. Not a plastic poncho, not a raincoat, but an old-fashioned sturdy umbrella with a nice long pointed metal tip and a metal shaft. Do you see where this is going? I hope so, because Linda certainly didn't. She marched outside, fighting gale force winds that were trying to save her life by pushing her back inside, and set up the ladder. She climbed up to the roof, clutching her metal umbrella like Mary Poppins with a death wish. Now, let's talk physics. Lightning seeks the path of least resistance to the ground. It loves height, and it loves conductive metal. Linda had just climbed to the highest point of her house and held a conductive metal spike above her head. She had effectively built a beacon that screamed, "Hey Zeus, strike here!" She shimmied over to the antenna, struggling to keep her balance on the slick shingles, holding the umbrella high to shield her perm. Neighbors who were peeking through their blinds later reported seeing her wrestling with the antenna, screaming at the sky. And then, the sky answered. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a direct hit. A bolt of lightning, carrying about 1 billion joules of energy, found the inviting metal tip of her umbrella. The connection was instantaneous. Linda didn't just get shocked. She got rebooted. The electricity traveled through the umbrella, through Linda, and into the roof, turning her into the world's most tragic conductor. She was dead before she even heard the thunderclap. She fell from the roof, not that the fall mattered much at that point. The irony is palpable. She went up there to fix the picture, but she ended up becoming a flash of light herself. She missed the reveal of the twins' father, but she did manage to provide the neighborhood with a shocking finale that no soap opera could ever hope to match. 5. Let's travel to Russia, a land where safety regulations are often treated as mere suggestions and ingenuity is fueled by a potent mixture of boredom and vodka. Meet Ivan. Ivan had a problem. The local authorities had rudely suspended his driver's license, likely due to a previous incident involving bad decisions and a moving vehicle. But Ivan was a man of action, a visionary who refused to let a little thing like the law impede his mobility. He needed to get across town, and he didn't have Uber money. He did, however, have a rope, a plastic sled intended for a 5-year-old child, and a complete lack of understanding regarding centrifugal force. His plan was simple, elegant, and suicidally stupid. He staked out a bus stop, waiting for the city bus like a predator stalking prey. When the bus arrived and the driver was distracted loading passengers, Ivan crept to the back. With the stealth of a ninja who had failed physics class, he tied his rope to the rear bumper of the bus and sat down on his little sled, gripping the rope with a grin that said, "I am a genius." The bus pulled away. At first, it went great. Ivan was gliding over the hard-packed snow, the wind in his face, feeling like the king of the road. He was saving money. He was beating the system. He was accelerating rapidly. What Ivan failed to account for was that city buses don't just drive in straight lines. They turn. And when a long vehicle takes a turn, the tail swings. If you are attached to that tail by a flexible rope, you become the weight at the end of a whip. The bus driver, completely oblivious to the fact that he was towing a grown man on a toy, approached a sharp intersection and took a hard left. Physics took over immediately. The bus turned left, but Ivan and his sled wanted to keep going straight until the rope snapped tight and whipped him in a massive, horrifying arc to the right. It was the crack the whip game from elementary school, but played with a 10-ton vehicle and on a public highway. Ivan accelerated to a speed that the plastic sled was never designed to handle. He swung out wide, leaving the safety of the bus's lane and entering the death zone, also known as the oncoming traffic lane. He looked up just in time to see the grille of an SUV that was minding its own business. There was no time to brake, mostly because sleds don't have brakes, but also because he was moving sideways at 30 miles per hour. The impact was essentially a bug hitting a windshield, if the bug was a middle-aged man in a fur hat. Ivan was launched from the sled and met his end instantly. The bus driver didn't even notice until he was pulled over miles later. Ivan's commute ended not at his destination, but in the morgue, proving that while you can hack many things in life, you cannot hack the laws of motion. He wanted a free ride. He got a one-way ticket to the afterlife. 6. We often romanticize prison escapes. Movies show us complex tunnels, elaborate disguises, and masterminds who outsmart the system. This story is not that. This is the story of Jacques, a prisoner in a French jail who watched too many cartoons and read too few textbooks. Jacques was tired of the prison food and the lack of freedom, so he hatched a plan as old as incarceration itself: the bedsheet rope. It's a classic for a reason, right? It's simple, it's quiet, and the materials are provided by the hotel. Jacques spent weeks collecting sheets, trading cigarettes for extra linens, and tying knots that he prayed would hold his weight. He was on the 5th floor, a height that any reasonable person would look at and say, maybe I should just serve my time. But Jacques was not reasonable. He was determined. He waited for a moonless night, the guards distracted, the ambiance perfect for a stealthy getaway. He tied one end of his fabric creation to the bars of his cell window, squeezed his body through the opening, and began his descent. So far, so good. He was climbing down, feeling the rush of adrenaline, the sweet taste of liberty on his tongue. He rappelled past the 4th floor, then the 3rd. He was doing it. He was the Count of Monte Cristo. But then he reached the end of the rope, literally. He looked down, expecting to see the grass just a few inches below his feet. Instead, he saw nothing but darkness and a drop that looked suspiciously lethal. Jacques had made a critical elementary school error. He hadn't measured. He had estimated. And his estimation was off by a solid 20 feet. He was now dangling at the 2nd-story level, swinging gently in the breeze, with no more sheet to climb down and no physical strength to climb back up 5 stories of vertical fabric. He was stuck in the worst kind of limbo. Too high to jump without shattering his legs, or worse, and too exhausted to retreat. He hung there. And hung there. For nearly an hour, Jacques was just a human piñata waiting for gravity to take a swing. You can only imagine the internal monologue, the regret, the bargaining, the realization that he was about to die because he couldn't do mental math. His muscles began to scream, burning with lactic acid. His grip, weakened by fear and fatigue, started to slip. He tried to wrap his legs around the rope to rest, but the slick cotton offered no purchase. Finally, his hands just gave up. He didn't want to let go, but his body resigned. He plummeted the remaining 20 feet. Now, 20 feet might not sound like a skyscraper, but landing on concrete from that height is unforgiving. He hit the ground with a sickening thud. He didn't die on impact, but the internal injuries were catastrophic. He was found the next morning, broken and lifeless, lying directly beneath his dangling too-short rope. A visual punchline to a joke he wrote himself. Jacques proved that in the game of prison breaks, close enough doesn't count. If you're going to bet your life on a rope, bring a tape measure, or at least make sure you pass geometry. 7. There is a specific breed of human stupidity that only reveals itself when the temperature drops below zero. Welcome to Canada, the land of maple syrup, politeness, and the inexplicable desire to jump into freezing water for fun. This brings us to our next contender, a college student we'll call Kevin. Kevin was the quintessential hold my beer guy, a man whose confidence was inversely proportional to his actual skill set. The setting was a New Year's polar bear swim, an event where people willingly induce hypothermia to feel alive. Usually, these events are safe. You run into the lake, scream like a banshee, and run back to a warm towel. But this event was hardcore. It involved swimming under the ice from one hole to another, a distance of merely 6 feet. The organizers, realizing that human beings are generally terrible at navigating underwater in the dark, had installed a bright yellow safety guide rope connecting the entry hole to the exit hole. It was a lifeline. It was common sense made manifest. But Kevin looked at that rope and saw an insult. He told the safety marshals, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I was the captain of my swim team. I don't need a leash." He viewed the safety rope the way a cat views a bath, with absolute disdain. He was going to freestyle it. Now, let's talk about the physiology of the cold shock response. When you plunge into water that is barely liquid, your body doesn't just get cold, it panics. Your lungs gasp involuntarily, your heart rate spikes to techno remix levels, and your blood vessels clamp shut. Your brain enters a state of primal confusion. Kevin dove into the entry hole with the grace of a swan and the foresight of a lemming. He hit the water, and immediately, the cold hit him like a freight train made of ice cubes. The shock was instantaneous. But here is the critical part. Under the ice, it is dark. Pitch black. And without the rope he so arrogantly refused, he had absolutely no tactile point of reference. He spun around, disoriented by the cold and the darkness. He thought he was swimming forward toward the exit, but in reality, he was swimming sideways, parallel to the surface. He was trapped under a ceiling of solid ice. The exit hole was literally 6 feet away, 2 arm strokes. But without the guideline, it might as well have been on Mars. Onlookers watched the empty exit hole, waiting for Kevin's triumphant pop-up. Seconds turned into a minute. The strong swimmer was currently proving that swimming skills don't matter when you don't know which way is up. Panic set in, consuming his remaining oxygen. He scratched at the underside of the ice, a desperate, silent plea for the help he had mocked just moments ago. By the time the safety divers realized what was happening and pulled him out, it was too late. Kevin had drowned in 6 feet of water, mere inches from safety, simply because his ego was too bloated to hold onto a piece of rope. He wanted to look like a hero. Instead, he became a frozen cautionary tale about why you should always take the safety gear, no matter how cool you think you are. 8. Everything is bigger in Texas, including the stubbornness, the heat, and apparently, the capacity for bad decision-making. This story takes us to the sweltering parking lot of a car dealership, the site of a hands-on-a-hard-body contest. The rules are simple and sadistic. You put one gloved hand on a brand-new truck, and the last person standing drives it home. It's a test of endurance, willpower, and bladder control. Enter Martha, a woman who wanted that truck with a ferocity usually reserved for apex predators protecting their young. Martha was not just competitive, she was biologically incapable of quitting. The contest began, and hours turned into days. The Texas sun beat down on the asphalt, turning the parking lot into a convection oven. Contestants dropped like flies, fainting or simply giving up, but not Martha. She stood there, her hand glued to the hot metal, staring down her rivals. But Martha had a fatal flaw in her strategy. She believed that stopping for water was a sign of weakness. The organizers offered water breaks, mandatory, legally required water breaks, but Martha was in the zone. She waved them off. "I'm fine," she rasped, her lips cracking like a dry riverbed. She was convinced that if she broke her focus for even a second to drink, she would lose her edge. This went on for 72 hours, 3 days, in the Texas heat. Now, let's look at the biology of dehydration. Your blood thickens, becoming sludge. Your body stops sweating because it has no moisture left to give, which means your internal temperature skyrockets. This is called hyperthermia. Martha's brain began to cook inside her skull. She started hallucinating. Witnesses said she was talking to the truck, promising it a nice garage. She wasn't sweating anymore, her skin was hot to the touch, and her pulse was thready. But her hand stayed on that truck. She viewed her biological collapse as mental toughness. Finally, the laws of physiology, which do not care about your willpower or your desire for a Ford F-150, pulled the plug. Martha collapsed. She didn't just faint, her organs effectively resigned in protest. She hit the pavement, still reaching for the truck in her final moments. Paramedics arrived, but you can't rehydrate a raisin and expect it to turn back into a grape instantly. She died of massive organ failure brought on by extreme heat stroke. She literally died for a truck, a vehicle she could never drive because she was dead. The dealership, in a move of grim irony, canceled the contest. Martha didn't win the truck, but she did win a permanent spot in the local cemetery and a legacy as the woman who valued a V8 engine more than her own kidneys. It's the ultimate consumerist tragedy. She paid the highest price possible, and she didn't even get the goods. 9. There is a fine line between spiritual awakening and fatal trespassing, and our next visionary didn't just cross that line. He moonwalked over it while chanting Om. Meet Zephyr, born Gary, a self-proclaimed New Age guru who believed that modern science was a scam and that the answers to the universe lay in vibrating crystals. Zephyr was convinced that a recently discovered sealed chamber in an Egyptian pyramid contained a vortex of cosmic energy that could ascend him to a higher plane of existence. The authorities called it an active archaeological site. Zephyr called it his destiny. Under the cover of darkness, bribing a guard with cash, because apparently cosmic energy doesn't pay the bills, he snuck into the excavation site. He found the entrance to the unmapped chamber, a small, dusty room that hadn't seen a human in 4,000 years. To achieve a state of absolute purity for his ritual, Zephyr stripped completely naked, because nothing says respect the ancestors like being nude in their tomb. He sat in the center of the room, surrounded by silence, and began to chant, vibrating his vocal cords to match the frequency of the universe. But here's the thing about ancient Egyptian architects. They were geniuses, and they hated looters. They built traps. Not magical curses, but mechanical engineering marvels powered by sand and gravity. In the corner of the room was a small, unassuming stone plinth. Zephyr, in his rhythmic trancing, reached out and grabbed it for stability. He pulled. A distinct click echoed in the chamber. He had pulled a release pin. Somewhere in the walls, a plug opened, and sand began to pour out of a counterweight chamber. It was a hydraulic system made of dust. As the sand drained, the massive stone block above the doorway, which had been held up by that sand for 4 millennia, began to slide. Zephyr heard the grinding noise. He looked up. He saw the multi-ton slab descending. A rational man would dive for the door. Zephyr, however, believed he could stop it with his mind. He held up his hands, channeling his energy at the falling rock. Spoiler alert, rock beats energy. The slab slammed shut with a thud that sealed the room hermetically. The sound of his chanting was replaced by absolute, suffocating silence. He wasn't crushed. He was trapped. The air supply was limited. He spent his final hours in the dark, naked, realizing that the cosmic vortex was actually just a really efficient airtight seal. Archaeologists opened the chamber a year later. They found Zephyr, perfectly preserved by the ultra-dry desert air. He had become a modern mummy, preserved for all time not by the careful rituals of priests, but by his own monumental stupidity. He wanted to be one with the ancients, and in the most literal, ironic way possible, he succeeded. 10. We end our journey in rural India. a place where devotion runs deep and traffic laws run shallow. Meet Raj, a man who decided that walking forward was simply too mainstream. In a bid to prove his extreme devotion to a local deity and perhaps gain a bit of local celebrity status, Raj took a sacred vow to live his entire life walking backward. Yes, backward. Everywhere. To the market, to the temple, to the bathroom. For years, this actually worked. He developed a sort of bat sense, navigating his village by memory and the shouts of neighbors. He became a local legend, the reverse pilgrim. Tourists took photos. He felt invincible. He had mastered the art of the rewind. But Raj had a fatal blind spot, quite literally. He couldn't see the future because he was always facing the past. And the future was arriving in the form of technological advancement. For years, the dangers of the Indian roads were loud. Diesel trucks, honking motorbikes, shouting ox cart drivers. You could hear death coming from a mile away. But the government had recently introduced a new fleet of eco-friendly electric rickshaws. These vehicles are sleek, efficient, and most importantly, silent. They move like ghosts on rubber tires. On the final day of his life, Raj was strutting backward down the main road, confident in his mental map of the potholes. He heard the usual cacophony of the street and filtered it out. What he didn't hear was the electric rickshaw zooming up behind him at 30 miles per hour. The driver of the rickshaw saw a man walking in the road and assumed, logically, that the man could see him. After all, faces are usually on the front of heads. By the time the driver realized Raj was walking backward and wasn't going to step aside, it was too late. Physics, as always, demanded a sacrifice. Raj stepped backward directly into the path of the silent vehicle. The impact was brutal. He was knocked flat, never knowing what hit him. He spent his life looking back at where he had been, and he died because he refused to look at where he was going. The irony is as thick as the curry he was walking to buy. He was killed by the only vehicle on the road that respected his vow of silence. In the end, Raj proved that blind faith is one thing, but blind walking is a traffic violation that carries the ultimate penalty. He backed his way right out of the gene pool, leaving behind a lesson for us all. Facing your problems is generally better than turning your back on them, especially when your problems have wheels. After watching a man pickle his brain with soy sauce and another mummify himself in a pyramid trap, I have a serious question. Which is the deadlier sin? Arrogance or delusion? Was the swimmer who refused the rope dumber than the guy walking backward into a rickshaw? Debate the king of idiots in the comments. I'm pinning the best argument. Like and subscribe to keep your IQ above room temperature.